Thanks to Envato Elements for sponsoring this video. For more information, check the affiliate link in the description. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Weekend Visual Effects. As we're all aware of, it's currently summer season and the days have been super hot, so let's freshen things up a bit with some thunder. Real-life lightning is freaking cool, and looking at slow-motion reference footage is pretty much the best way of understanding how it looks and how you should go about recreating it. So before anything else, make sure to find reference footage, which should be pretty easy since there's plenty of them out there, and analyze them. There's one really cool video from the slow-mo guys where they shoot lightning with this phantom camera at very high frame rates, and it is absolutely glorious. I will make sure to leave links to the reference I used in the description. After Effects does have a plugin dedicated to creating lightning effects, but it is 2D and doesn't really give you much control when it comes to art directing its animation. So throughout this tutorial, we're going to be utilizing a maybe less known tool called Motion Sketch, which allows us to record the input from our mouse movement and apply it to the position of any layer in order to achieve more organic animation. And then use the CC Particle World Effect, which is a particle system that comes with After Effects in order to create 3D lighting that allows us to really dial in the look and animation, while at the same time giving us the option to orbit in 3D space. After we create the main lightning effect, then we'll add a bunch of additional effects on top to give it some more texture, colorize it, and finally add some beautiful glow. We will only be creating a simple lightning asset just for the sake of showing the process. Then I will go ahead and break down an already finished 3D lightning scene, because once you understand the core concept of the effect, then from that point on, it's just a repetitive process. We will also take a look at this shot where I composited a thunder effect onto and break it down in detail. Thunder, feel the thunder. The project files for this tutorial will be provided on my Gumroad page, and as always you can get them for free, while also having the option to support the channel if you so choose to. I've only briefly covered the main steps of this effect, but there are a lot of tiny nuggets of knowledge spread out across the entire tutorial, so make sure to stick around until the end, because there could always be something new for you to learn. And with that said, let's go ahead and get started. Alright, so here we are now in After Effects, and as you can see I have all of the original comps open, which we're gonna come back to and break them down later on. For now, we'll create a new comp by going up to Composition, New Composition. We'll call it 3D Lightning, tut. We'll leave it at 1080p. A frame rate of 60 is fine because we want to be able to maybe time remap this later on just in case we want to slow it down even further. As for the duration, we can maybe set it to like 8 seconds. And here's a quick tip. If you type in the number and then type in full stop or dot, that will make the duration 8 seconds long, which you can see right over here. If you do 2 dots, it'll be 8 minutes long, and then 3 dots, it'll be 8 hours long, which I guess the cap is 3 hours for some reason. But anyway, we'll leave it at 8 and then hit OK. Now we'll create a new null object, which will serve as our emitter. And we could animate a path manually, say select the layer, hit P to bring up the position, turn on the stopwatch, then move forward a bit. Bring it over here, move forward some more, bring it over here, and da-da-da. But that does take a bit more time because we have to animate it manually and it can result in a more unnatural looking path. And then we can right click, transform, reset. And you can see that I already binded a shortcut for this because I do use it quite a lot. And you can do that by going over to Edit, Keyboard Shortcuts, type in reset, and that should pop up right there. Anyway, we'll hit Alt-R. Instead, what we're gonna use is a tool that maybe not a lot of you are familiar with, and that is the Motion Sketch tool, which is probably not going to be available by default on your workspace. So to bring it up, you can go over to Window, Motion Sketch. And I'll quickly show you what it allows you to do. So we'll select the null layer and then hit Start Capture. So we get this cross symbol. And as soon as we click and drag, you can see we can actually draw a path here. And now if we hit P, that input has been applied as keyframes onto our null's position. But let's just uncheck the keyframes and then we'll go over to the other settings here. So the smoothing basically averages out the keyframes so you don't have as many points, but we don't want to do that for now. So we'll set it down to 0. So there's a keyframe for basically every frame. And then we have show wireframe or background. The wireframe is basically the UI element. So if we hit Start Capture now, we can see the null layer there, the square icon. But if we have the wireframe turned to off and then hit start capture, the null object is no longer visible. The background option defines if you want to have the other layers in the comp visible as you're capturing the path. So we'll leave it to off. Let's reset the position one more time. You might have also guessed that this tool is very useful for animating cursors to have them go like that and get some very realistic movement on your cursor animations. And before we draw the path, let's go over to the reference folder I have here and we'll drag in this thunder image. Hit W to bring up the rotation tool and then click and hold down shift to snap it to 90 degrees like so. Hit V, go back to the selection tool. We'll scale it up just so we fill the entire scene. Then we'll right click, turn this into a guide layer so it doesn't render later on. We'll hit T to bring up the opacity, set it to 50%. We'll bring it down at the bottom and finally lock it. So we'll use this as a reference to draw our shape here. So with the null selected, we'll hit start capture again and start drawing here. Oh, there you go. That's the background option. So we'll Control Z to undo and turn on the background so we can see the layer even when we start capturing. So we'll click there and as you can see, it doesn't go away. So we can trace this. Doesn't have to be perfect. Now let's shut this off for a moment and let's just say we want to adjust this after the fact. Well, it is going to be a bit problematic because the motion sketch tool has created a bunch of points for us to adjust the path, so it wouldn't really be ideal to adjust this many points. So how do we simplify this? Well, remember the smoothing option up here, which bakes in the smoothing? Well, there's actually a tool that we can use after the fact, which is conveniently called Smoother. And again, you can bring that up by going over to Window, Smoother. So let's select the position keyframes and let's say bring up the tolerance to maybe 10 and hit apply. And you can see how that just removes a bunch of keyframes and averages out all the remaining keyframes. And now we have only a few points here to work with and we can now more easily adjust the path if we wanted to. We could also select all the keyframes, maybe right click, go over to keyframe interpolation and set the spatial interpolation to linear, which will give us linear keyframes. But we'll Control Z to go back because we do want to have a bit of a curve here on our path. And I'll quickly create a new solid here. We'll do, I don't know, just a small circle. Just bear with me for a moment. I just want to demonstrate something. So we have this circle and we'll parent it to the null while holding down shift, which will parent it to the null and also jump to its position. And this is just for visual purposes. And then we'll select all the keyframes, hold down Alt while clicking on the last keyframe, which will allow you to shrink down the speed of all of these keyframes at once. And I'm doing this just so it's a bit more obvious the issue that we're having. So we'll hit 0 to RAM preview. And you can see because of the way we captured our mouse movement, sometimes the null moves at a slower speed and then starts moving at a faster speed. So the speed overall is inconsistent. A quick and easy solution for that is to use the Rove Across Time feature, which we can do by selecting all the keyframes, right click, Rove Across Time. And as you saw, all of those keyframes in between got shifted in time to compensate and give us a consistent speed. So depending on the last keyframe's position and the first keyframe's position, those in between keyframes are going to automatically adjust. And now if we preview this again, the circle moves at a consistent speed. Now I want to show you one more way of creating paths in After Effects before we move on with the particles. So let's delete the circle, we'll select the null, and then we'll hit G to bring up the pen tool up here. And then let's just say draw a path here. So we'll click, 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 and then it will hit M to bring up the mask. Select the mask path, so not the mask, but the mask path itself. We'll hit Control C to copy, then hold down Shift, hit P to bring up the position while also keeping the mask. And then we'll alt check the position keyframes, go back to the beginning, and then with the position value selected, we can hit Control V to paste. And this allows us to apply that mask shape as a position path. Now we can select the mask, delete it, and maybe select the position. Make sure you're sitting on one of those keyframes, and then click and hold on the path here and just reposition it like so. And you can do the same thing in reverse. So we'll select the position, hit Control C to copy, then we'll just create a random mask here, hit M, select the mask path, hit Control V, and that pastes the mask back on. Oh, and one more thing is that the size of these UI elements of the mask and also the position points by default are very small and can sometimes be very tedious to adjust. If you want to increase that, which I have, you can go over to Edit, Preferences, General, and right here at the top it says Path Point and Handle Size. By default it's set to 5, but I have set it to 10, just so it's a bit easier to adjust. And now we'll go over to layer, new solid, we'll call this lightning particles, make comp size, and then hit OK. And then I'll hit Control Space to bring up the FX Console tool, which is a third-party plugin from Video Copilot, and it's totally free. And it allows you to quickly add effects by hitting Control Space on a layer and typing in whatever effect you want to add. So we'll do CC Particle World and hit Return. First of all, let's go over to the grid and guides, and we'll shut off all of the guides because we don't need to see them because they are distracting. Then we'll go over to the producer, and what we want to do is link all of these XYZ values to the position of our null. Now you may be thinking there are 3 values here for the position, whereas the null has one single value and it contains the X, Y, and also if it were 3D, it would be Z as well. So how are we gonna link those up? Well, one way would be to say right click here and go over to separate dimensions. So we now have X, Y, and Z position values on their own channels. And then we can go back here, alt click on those and pick whip them. But that makes it a bit tedious to control because now we have to animate every single channel here individually. So we'll undo, and instead we're gonna use an expression. So we'll select the lightning particles, alt click on the position X, and then I'll copy the expression I have here on my second monitor and just paste it. Then we'll go down a bit, do the same thing for the position Y, I'll copy the expression, and finally position Z, and there you go. Now we're getting this error here because the name we're referencing in the expression is null1, whereas the name of our null is null26. And instead we'll actually do path. By the way, I'm hitting return on the keyboard to rename layers. Then we'll go back to the expression, click on it, we'll select this, do path, do the same thing for the Y, and the same thing for the Z. And now we have successfully linked our particle position to our null's position. One more thing to point out is that if your null is 2D, it's gonna show you this error. We're trying to make 3D lightning here, so how are you gonna do 3D lightning with a 2D null? Come on now. Oh, and with the expression here, you don't need to worry about understanding it. Just copy and paste it and you're good to go. Now let's zero out the radius X, Y, Z because we want these particles to come out of a single point. Then under physics, we'll zero out the velocity and gravity as well. And we're halfway there. Now, depending on the speed at which the path is moving, you might want to increase the birth rate because let's just select the path and say we bring this all the way over here. So it's moving very quickly. Now, if we zoom in, hit Ctrl-Shift-H to hide the UI elements and go back to full, you might be able to notice the gaps between the particles. And that's because we don't have enough particles being emitted per second to fill in those gaps. So let's say set it to 10 for now, and that should give you a very solid line. As for the longevity, which is the lifespan of our particles, let's say set it to 4. Then we'll mess with the particle look. So we'll change the particle type to say faded sphere for now. The birth size, let's set it to 0.1 for the time being, and the death size to 0 because we want these particles to vanish as they die out. Then we'll also increase the size variation to 100% to give it a bit more texture, max opacity to 100%, and then under the opacity map, we have this graph that represents the opacity of our particles across their lifespan. So this is at their birth and this is at their death. So we want them to be popping in right away at the birth and then slowly fade out over time. Also, if you hold down Control, we get this different icon popping up, and then left click and drag left and right to smooth out the shape. We have the color map, which defines the color of our particles, and by default it's set to birth to death, which is what we're gonna use. But let's quickly go over the different options here. So we have custom, which basically has the same at birth and color at death, but also gives us some more control in between. So we can set the color of the particles at 25% of their lifespan, at 50% of their lifespan, and at 75% of their lifespan. Then we have origin to death, which grays out the birth color because it's using the color of the solid as our birth color. And then you can set the death color here. Vice versa, birth to origin, it's gonna gray out the death color because it is using the solid's color as the death color. And finally, we have origin constant, which grays out both of the colors and only uses the color of our solid. But anyway, we'll go back to birth to death and we'll set the birth color to white and the death color to black. And the reason we're doing this is so we have grayscale values and then we can colorize this to whatever we want very easily. Now, as for the shape of our path, we have whatever we drew in here, but it still looks a bit too smooth. So what we're gonna do is go over to layer, new, null object, and we'll rename this to wiggle. By the way, we can color code these just so it's a bit easier to see. Oh, we have to unlock that to color code it and lock it back up. And then with the wiggle null selected, you can hit Control Space to bring up the effects console and type in wiggle. And then we have these presets and we'll choose wiggle position, which adds this controller up here that has two values, the wiggle speed and the wiggle amount. By the way, if you don't have FX console, which I don't know why you wouldn't, because it's free, you can go over to the window, effects presets, and find that preset over here as well. So just type in wiggle and you have the same preset over here. And the reason we added that is because we want to link the position of our emitter to the wiggle so it wiggles around across the timeline, as a result giving us more detail with a jagged looking path. So we'll lock the effects controls panel here so it doesn't go away once we click to another layer. Bring up the position and alt click on the stopwatch and then type in wiggle, open parentheses, and then pick whip the first value, hit comma, pick whip the second value. And now we can increase the speed, which is really the frequency, to say 30, and right away we can see changes to our path. We can also decrease the amount a bit because we don't want this to go too crazy. All we're looking for is to just add some variation along the path. So there's the original path, and then this is the path being affected by the wiggle expression. Now at this point we do need to increase the birth rate to fill in the gaps here, so we'll select the particles layer, unlock the effects controls, and then over here at the birth rate, let's set it to say 30. And then hit the stopwatch, hit U, and this is what we'll do. Let's just say we want the path to take about 2 seconds. We'll drag this keyframe over. Now that it's taken a bit longer to go from this side to this side, the wiggle is a bit too much. So let's just set the wiggle speed to 30 and the amount to something like 15 instead. So just to quickly show you the difference, I'll disable the expression by clicking this button and then re-enable it. So you can see how much more detail is being added. Then we'll also bring over the first keyframe, so it starts about here. And we'll set the birth rate keyframe right on the same frame as the first frame of our emitter. Then we'll go back to the beginning, set this to 0, and then all the way at the end, also set this to 0. Now, of course, this is gonna interpolate in between the keyframes. So what we can do is select all of them, right click, toggle hold keyframes, which will hold the same value as the last keyframe before the playhead hits the next keyframe in the timeline, which in this case is 0. And you'll see how convenient this setup is once we get to adding more paths that diverge from our lightning. Oh, and one more thing I want to show you is there's this value here that says inherit velocity, which we can set to say a very low value, like 1%. We don't want to overdo this. And what happens is the particles take into account the movement of our emitter and then follow through with that movement. And that could be something that you want to add to your lightning effect just to give it a bit more life. But seeing as we're going for a slow motion type of lightning, we'll just set that down to 0. Also, I'm thinking the line looks a bit too thick right now, so maybe go down to the birth size and we'll set it to 0.05 instead. Now let's also create a custom sprite that will be used for the particle type, which we can do by going over to the texture square type. Now before we get to use it, we first need to create the sprite. So we'll go to layer, new, solid, and we'll make this very small because this sprite is going to be used to generate a huge amount of particles, so we don't want to slow down our computer. So we'll do lightning sprite tut and hit OK. Then we'll go over to layer, pre-compose. We'll leave all attributes and then hit OK. And by leaving all the attributes, we make sure that the comp settings are the same as the layer size, which is 50 by 50 pixels. Then with the layer selected here, make sure you're on the ellipse tool here, which we can toggle by clicking Q on the keyboard, and then just double click on it to make a perfect circle. Then we'll add the roughen edges effect. We'll increase the border a bit, maybe go over to full and hide the mask, let's say 20 or so. And we can also increase the scale so it's not as detailed, and even increase the edge sharpness. We'll also add a turbulent displace effect. We'll turn down the size to say 5, and we'll duplicate the same effect, and for this one we'll set the size to 25. Then I'll go back to the roughen edges, and under the evolution stopwatch we'll alt click and add a simple expression like time times, let's say 600, so it keeps evolving over time, and then copy this expression and paste it to the evolutions of both of our turbulent displace effects, so we have some more movement over time. Another thing I want to do is scale this down a bit, so we'll do say 75, and then also alt click on the scale value, type in wiggle, and let's say 15,25. So that means 15 times a second it'll scale up and down by up to 25%. So in our case, because we have this set to 75% scale, it can go up to as much as 100% and as low as 50%. And if we let go, we can now preview that, so we get this very random looking shape. Now we can go back to the original comp by either clicking here or use the tab shortcut, which brings up this little menu here that allows you to go back into other comps, which is very useful in cases where you have a bunch of comps open here. So instead of being confused, you can tab, go back, easy does it. Now we'll go over to the particle type under texture. We'll select the lightning sprite tut to be our texture layer. We'll also shut this off because we don't need to see it and bring it down at the bottom. And also the texture time as is now is gonna give us very weird results because if we just zoom in here, scrub through the timeline, you can see the line is kind of flickering in scale. And that's because it's using the current texture time of our sprite. Instead, we want to set this to birth. So each particle gets assigned a scale value based on the scale of our sprite at the point of which that particle is given birth to. Now let's give that a quick preview. I'm thinking we can set the longevity to say 3 seconds instead, so they die out a bit sooner. Now let's go ahead and duplicate this and you'll see just how easy it is to make multiple copies of this. So we'll select both the lightning particles layer and the path and then duplicate them. And before we do anything else, we'll select the copy here. Let's rename that to 2. And with it selected, we'll search for the position values up here at the search bar, and that will reveal all the position channels. And then we'll select this, change this to 2, so it's referencing the second null that we duplicated. And now it's gonna follow that second null. Now, of course, we also need to change the path animation. So we'll use the motion sketch again. Now, before we do anything though, let's just find a point in time where we want this to branch out. So let's say at this point right here, we want the second lightning to branch out from here. So what we'll do is select the path, make sure it's not 3D, because if we click start capture, it'll show us this error that we cannot motion sketch 3D layers. So we'll go back to 2D. Then we'll also set the work area in to this point, which just makes sure that we start capturing from that point onwards. And you can see the start and duration here, which are defined by the work area. Then we'll zoom out a bit, hit P, and then delete the original keyframes. We can also disable the expression for the time being because it tends to mess up the input sometimes. And then with it selected, just hit start capture and then click drawing from this point on. Now again, we might want to adjust the path a little bit. So with the keyframe selected, tolerance of 10, let's hit apply, and that averages out the keyframes. Then hit right click, rove across time, and let's just bring this in a bit. Now let's also turn this back to 3D so we get rid of the error, and then maybe adjust this. Let's say go. Maybe we can even select one of these and just delete them right away. Now for this second copy, I think I'm gonna scale down the size as well. So we'll do 0.03 instead, just so it's a bit smaller compared to the main lightning strike. And in fact, we'll do 0.06 for that. And we're still able to see some gaps in between the particles, so we can always just increase the birth rate. Oh, and that reminds me, we can bring up the keyframes of the birth rate on the second copy that we just created. And now what we want to do is don't touch the first keyframe, which is 0. Instead, we want to bring the second keyframe to the first frame of our emitter animation, and then the other keyframe to the last frame. And you can see how convenient it is. Now we just don't touch the first keyframe, and because these are all hold keyframes, they're going to hold those values until they hit these points. And let's also re-enable the expression. Maybe you can dial down the amount here to say 10, so it's not too crazy. By the way, when it comes to wiggling things in After Effects, there's also this tool called Wiggler, which is basically the same as using the wiggle expression, but in a destructive way, because it bakes everything into keyframes. Now, up until this point, we've been working in this sort of 2D view, but let's not forget that if we create a new camera, hit OK, 15 millimeters is fine. Then hit C to bring up the camera tool, and left click, we can actually orbit in 3D because this particle system is 3D, and we know that by looking over at this icon right here, which is this cube, and that lets us know that this is a 3D effect. So at this point, we can just orbit around, select an angle that we want, and then also switch to say 2 views. And then for this one, we'll set it to active camera, and then for this, we'll set it to the top view. And for now, we can see that the paths are just moving in a straight line from the top view. But what we can do is say select the path 2 and then adjust these paths to go over to the side instead, like so. While at the same time, just keeping an eye out on the main camera view. By the way, you can hold down Alt to enable all of the camera tools. So with left click, you can orbit, right click, you can dolly in and out, and then middle click, you can move around the scene or pan around. And then right away, you can see there's an issue here. So at the top view, it looks like this point is meeting with the first path, but from the camera view, it's actually not. So we can switch to, say, the left view. And then from this view, you can see that the first point here is not lining up with the original path. So we can drag it over. Actually, from this angle, it's still not connecting. So we can maybe adjust it from this angle. And at this point, we could continue to duplicate these paths, add more lightning strands and everything, but I think you get the point. So let's go ahead and do one more thing before we pre-render this as an asset, and then finally try to add some more texture to this, colorize it, and add some glow effects. We'll select one of these layers, and then we'll add the exposure effect. Then we'll set the exposure to 1, and then alt-click on the exposure and type in wiggle. let's say 30, 1, then copy the effect and paste it onto the second copy. And this is just gonna wiggle the exposure of our lightning layers, which will come in very handy when we add the glow effects and everything. I'm also thinking we can pump up the birth rate at this point. So let's say 60 and also 60. So we just make sure there are no gaps in between the particles. Oh, and also I noticed that this has gone over now because I tweaked the path animation. So let's just make sure we drag that back. And finally, let's find a point at which we no longer see the particles. So 5 seconds, hit N, and then hit Control M to add this to the render queue. We'll do QuickTime, RGB alpha, so we take into account the alpha channel, set a destination, and finally hit render. Once we have our lightning asset rendered out, we can bring it back into the main comp and then shut off the original particles layers. So now we can work a bit faster when adding additional effects. And in fact, we'll add the effects on top of an adjustment layer instead. So we'll rename this to effects, color code this. And the first effect we're gonna add is the roughen edges effect. And we do wanna keep this very subtle, so we'll go down to say 1 for the border. We'll increase the edge sharpness back up to 4, lower the scale all the way down to 10. So we have a bunch more detail. And now if we go over here to this side where we can see the particles dying out, that's where we can most notice this effect. And we could also increase the complexity as well for even more detail. The next effect we're gonna add is the turbulent displace effect. And for this, we'll leave the amount at 50, and for the size, we'll tone it down a lot to like 5. And then we can see the before and after for that. Then we'll duplicate this, 25 amount, and then increase the size for this to say 50. Now, at this point, I do want to point out something very important, and that is the turbulent displace effects and the roughen edges effects add a noise pattern which is 2D. So while we're in this 2D view where nothing is moving, the camera is staying still, everything is gonna be fine. But let's say shut off this one and then bring up the original particles, which we can use to orbit around the scene. And then we'll animate the position and rotation here real quick, just so we can preview that a bit more easily. If you look here on the lightning, as the camera is orbiting, the texture on the lighting is changing. And again, that's because these effects like the roughen edges and turbulent displace are 2D based effects. And seeing as we're going for a more frozen in time effect, this might not be ideal, but it's actually given a kind of a flowing energy sort of look. So I actually like it very much. Anyway, we'll shut these back off and turn on the rendered asset instead. And now let's go ahead and add some color to this. So you could use something like curves and hue saturation. So let's say set the red channel and bring it down, and then increase the blue channel to bluify this. And then add a hue saturation as well, boost the saturation. Or say even delete the curves and then use the colorize feature, boost the saturation, and then adjust the hue. But let's delete that, and what I like to use instead is the color vibrance effect, which is also from Video Copilot, and it is totally free. It basically allows you to pick a color here, so we'll do something like a darkish bluish. And then it allows you to control the vibrance, so how vibrant you want it to be. Then you can also decrease the preserve luminance, which allows you to bring some color into the highlights as well. Then we can bring down the brightness a bit, so we're not clipping those highlights. And also tweak the gamma if we want to, but we'll leave it at default. And the next thing we're gonna do is add some glow. But before we go ahead and add the glow effects, let's go back to the project panel and just make sure we're set to 32 bits per channel. So we have the maximum amount of data to work with, which is very important, especially when it comes to glow effects. You can change that by alt-clicking on it to toggle between 8, 16, or 32, or even just clicking here and then switching it right here. We'll go back to the effects controls and add the glow effect, scroll down. And what I like to do with glow effects is set the threshold to 0%, so it affects the entire asset. And then we'll set the intensity all the way down to something like 0.1, so it's very subtle, and then increase the radius to 20, so it's a tight glow. And then we'll duplicate the glow. And for the second copy, we'll pump up the radius to say 100 and then duplicate it one last time. And for this one, we'll pump it way up to say 500. And this way we get this very smooth looking glow. Maybe that's a bit too much though, so we'll tone it down to 300. And let me go back to the project panel real quick and switch back to 8 bits per channel. And you can see how the glow effect kind of vanishes and we have to go back to the intensity and really pump this up. And even then we don't get those rich colors in the glow. So let's Control Z, undo, go back to 32 bits per channel. And those are pretty much the effects that I added in the original version. And you can actually hit Control A, drop all of these down and just save these as a preset. So we'll select all of them, go over to animation, save animation preset. And then we'll call this, I don't know, lightning preset. And now we can delete all of them, bring back up the effects and presets panel and just search for a lightning preset. And with the layer selected, just double click and that adds back all of those effects. Now let's do a couple more things right at the end here. So we'll select the effects and then add the CC vector blur effect. And if we just increase that right away, you can see what it does. It basically chokes in a very interesting way. And we can actually bring this up before the glow. So the glow happens after the vector blur. And I want to set this to 0 and then set a keyframe for the amount, hit U, and right over here at the end, as the lighting is dying down, we want to increase the vector blur as well, just to choke that out a bit. So we'll do something like 20 and also smooth this out. And then we can also add some noise to the whole thing. So something like 5% or so. All right, so there you go. We pretty much covered the entire 3D lighting step by step, completely from scratch. And now we can move on to the other scenes and break them down. All right, so here I have the forest lightning scene, and I pretty much use the same techniques and methods as we did up until this point. Except you can see here I have 6 copies instead. If I switch over to the 4 views, you can better see all of these paths in different orthographic views. So you can see up here at the top, the way these nulls are moving around the scene throughout the timeline. And to be honest, it did take quite a while to animate each individual path due to handling the lightning and it electrocuting me and burning me up. No, but really, working with 3D layers in After Effects can be quite clunky and tedious sometimes because it's a bit hard to move things around and also a bit slow. Of course, I did tone down the birth rate and even use the quarter resolution, but still, I must have spent about 1 or 2 hours setting up the individual path animations in the orthographic views, all the while keeping an eye out on the camera view in order to art direct the animation, so I could get this sort of spiral look where each lightning strand is shooting in a different direction. So it does take a bit of time to really dial in the animation because it's all manual work, but in the end, it's all worth it. Or is it? As for the camera animation, I created a 3D null to which I parented the camera to, and as you can see, I animated the position and the Z rotation, so I'll just quickly switch back to one view. And animating cameras by using 3D null objects instead can make it a bit easier sometimes to work with, so I just had the camera dolly out throughout the animation and at the same time gave it some roll by animating the Z rotation, and also animated the zoom value to have it constantly zoom out even after the position animation settled in. And then I added all of the same effects that we covered before to give it some texture, some colorization and glow. And again, throughout the animation, you'll be able to notice the noise pattern shifting in position. But as I said before, I really dig it actually because it gives this sort of flowing energy look. Another thing you might notice is that each lightning strand is flickering differently. And that's because, again, I added the exposure effect on each of the lightning layers and had them wiggle independently. And then on top of this entire layer, I also added another exposure effect and had it flicker as a whole. So if we double click on the exposure effect, down here we can see the wiggle expression. I also copied over the camera animation together with the 3D null so that we could have it affect the CC environment that we're using here, which again is an HDRI image I got from polyhaven.com, and use the CC environment effect to have this wrap around our scene in 360 degrees, and then tweak the horizontal pan to have it face the direction I wanted it to. For some reason, there is no vertical pan here available, which I don't know why that is, but it would be pretty nice because as it is, I can only look left and right and not up and down, unless I'm using the camera. Then I blurred that out a lot with the camera lens blur effect for a realistic out of focus look, and then tinted it a bit to desaturate it and also added a curves effect to make it a bit more bluish. On top of that, I added this background layer, which is just a gradient ramp effect with some curves to dial in the contrast, and then another curves effect, which is isolated to this mask. And you can see there's this icon here, which basically means that we isolated that effect by using a mask, which I created on the layer. And if you go down to the effects, curves 2, there's this option here that says compositing option. And if we click plus on that, it allows us to isolate the effect to whatever mask we choose here. And this is how the background as a whole looks like when we combine the background layer with the HDRI map. I also duplicated the lightning asset, and on this duplicated copy, if I just shut off the effects here one by one, what I did was to add a fractal noise effect to the asset and then cranked up the contrast and lowered the brightness a bit. So I ended up with these patches of noise and also animated the evolution to give it some constant movement. And then I colorized this with the VC color vibrance effect. After that, I used a Luma key effect to key out the darker parts of the asset so that we were left with only the bright parts, and then used a fast box blur effect with the blur dimensions set to horizontal. So I got these horizontal streaks and also blurred them a bit on the vertical by using another copy of the fast box blur effect with the blur dimensions set to vertical. And then finally added an exposure effect just to flicker it on and off constantly. And then I also set it to screen blending mode with 50% opacity, so it's a bit more subtle than 100% with add blending mode. And if you focus at the bottom here, you can just make out those light streaks. And then finally, because I used 60 frames per second, I then re-rendered this whole shot and imported it back into another comp, and then enabled the time remapping for this clip. And if we hit U and toggle the graph editor with the time remap value selected, you can see how that graph looks like. Here I have 3 keyframes, which serve to have the lightning grow out very quickly and then smoothly turn into slow motion for the rest of the animation. And finally, you can see here, I also added some additional color correction with some curves and hue saturation to boost the saturation a bit, and also some noise. So here's without that adjustment layer, and here's with. Juicy. Now let's move on to the last shot we're going to be breaking down, which is the parking lot lightning scene. Same thing here, I created 3 particle systems, and again, to work a bit faster, I just re-rendered these as an asset with no effects, and then added all the additional effects to the pre-rendered asset. And as you can see, the parking lot image down here is a guide layer, and that's because I'm using it only as reference in this pre-comp. And then I brought this comp inside of the composite comp to composite all the additional effects like the reflection and masking out the clouds and everything. And the reason I did that is because I'm using multiple instances of the lightning asset. And so if I wanted to say change this at a later stage, all I have to do is go inside of this pre-comp, change this asset, and it would reflect across all of these instances in the composite comp. Now let me shut off all of these elements and we'll start from scratch. So first of all, the parking lot image, I did add some color correction to this. So this is the original image, and then I just darkened it down a bit, added some contrast and added some more blue into it. Then this is the main lightning layer, which you can see down here. And the only thing I did to this was add the set matte effect, which is using the matte clouds layer, which is this one right here. And if I turn it on, you can see I just masked out the cloud shape here because I wanted the lighting to kind of go behind this cloud shape. And I also used the roughen edges effect with a very low edge sharpness and also blurred it out even more. And then if we hit F, you can also see that I feathered out the masks as well. And that is being used as a matte to cut off the lightning. The set matte effect is actually a pretty cool effect. It's basically the same as just using the alpha matte or alpha inverted matte options, but you're using it as an effect so that you don't have to make multiple copies of the matte to use for different layers. And I did use this cloud matte for a bunch of these layers. So you can see here we have the next one in line, which is the lightning broad. And that's the same element pretty much, except I blurred it out a lot and added an exposure effect to boost the exposure, because when you blur things out, they kind of fade out and then we bring the exposure back on top just to boost it back up again. And this was used just as sort of a more broad glow to fill out more of the sky. And I also set the blending mode to screen because I found that add was a bit too intense. Another thing you might have noticed is that the lightning here and the lightning broad, as well as all of these other ones, are using mattes, which basically are the parking lot image. So if I solo that out, what's happening here is I'm using a colorama effect to turn this image into a black and white image, and then using the output cycle to set different points across this circle, and then just adjust the points to determine the contrast values, which is very similar to levels effect, except you get a lot more control by using the colorama effect. And I also masked out the top half of the image just to isolate the sky, and then I used that as a luma matte to only isolate the lightning across bright areas. Now if I solo out only the lightning elements, you can make out the silhouette of the trees and the grass here, which are not being affected. Then because we're isolating the clouds with a set matte effect, this part of the image was kind of standing out a bit because it was not being illuminated at all. So to help with that, I actually duplicated the lightning layer and used the set matte effect as well on this one, but this time I isolated it only to that cloud part and blurred it out a lot. And I think I also toned down the opacity a bit. And this just made it look like the lightning was illuminating the cloud from the back or from the inside. So you can see without that element and with that element. Then I added some reflections. So this is again the lightning layer, which I duplicated. And I'm gonna have to solo this out for a moment. So what I'm using is again the reflection matte, which is also the image. And I actually subtracted the mask to cut off the sky and only keep the ground. And if we were to solo this out, you can see the effect that has. It's basically introducing a bit of the texture from the original image into the reflection. As for the reflection lightning itself, I'm gonna shut off all of these effects and I'll start from scratch. So what I did first of all was to just flip the entire element vertically. So you can do that by right-clicking, transform, flip horizontal or vertical. And if I hit S, you can see that negative value there. And I think I also shrunk it down a bit for more of a 3D look. And then I proceeded to add this fast box blur exposure and CC composite combination, so which blurs it out by 50 pixels. Then I boosted the exposure because again, once we blur elements, they tend to fade out. So we bring that exposure back up with an exposure effect. And then I use the CC composite effect with the blending mode set to lighten to composite the original asset back on top of these two effects. Then I blurred them out again, brought the exposure back up again, composited back up on top one more time, and then blurred it out one last time. And this gave us very soft looking reflection on the ground. And then I have another copy of the reflection, which is pretty much the same thing, except for this one, I didn't use a colorama effect. I just masked out the puddles here that are a bit more reflective and then set the reflection sharp to alpha matte instead and blurred it out a lot less so that it would be a bit more visible. Kind of like you see here, you see the truck at this puddle. It's a lot more sharp in the reflection as opposed to this area here, which is a lot more diffused because it's just wet asphalt as opposed to a water puddle. Then I also duplicated the parking lot image down here for some environment lighting. So you can see I added a curves effect and just boosted the brightness here, and then added a mask to animate it come in based on the lightning. So if I set this to quarter to preview faster, you can see how the mask is revealing itself. And it has a huge amount of feather. And it's also using this layer as a matte, which again is being isolated by the colorama effect. And I'm using that as a Luma inverted matte instead to only have this environment lighting affect the dark areas as opposed to the bright areas. And then to have the environment lighting disappear at the end, I could have just animated the mask, but what I decided to do was use a linear wipe effect instead, which is just this transition effect that goes from right to left with a huge feather amount. On top of that, I also animated the opacity to have this layer fade in slowly and then fade out as well. Finally, I have this adjustment layer right on top with a curves effect for some additional contrast and blue tint, some noise, and a transform effect to give it some zoom across the entire animation. And this was just a quick and easy way to do that without having to create a null object and say have all of these parented to the null. And if we double click on the scale, you can see it's just a simple 100 to 105% scale animation. Alright guys, so that was pretty much everything I did when it comes to the parking lot shot. I did try to cover every single detail, so for that reason, I might have gone a bit faster in certain areas, so I hope you don't mind that. And I thought it made sense to break down this shot instead of recreating it from scratch, because then this tutorial would turn out to be like 5 hours long or even longer than that. But of course, if you do happen to have any questions, leave them down below in the comment section and I'll do my best to help you guys out. You could also hop into the project files yourself, which will be provided for free, and just explore around and see how everything was set up. And with that said, let's go ahead and move on to the outro of this video. Alright guys, that was all for this tutorial, so thanks for watching and being patient all the way through. Remember, you can download the project files for free on my Gumroad page while also having the option to support the channel with a donation. If you learned something new, then consider sharing it with others, and if you'd like to see more from this channel, then hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on the bell to be notified whenever a new video comes out. If you have any questions or suggestions for future tutorials, then feel free to leave a comment down below. Thank you once again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Peace out.